Hello and welcome to Decolonial Perspectives on Museums and Curricula. I am Ben Burbridge. I'm the head of the Art History Department here at Sussex. I'm just going to say a few words of introduction before handing over to our chair, Doug Haynes. This event is part of the inaugural Sussex Festival of Ideas, a dynamic and engaging programme of talks, events and activities. The festival is produced by the newly formed School of Media, Arts and Humanities at Sussex University. This event is being recorded and will be posted to the Sussex Festival of Ideas website after the festival. Live captioning is available and can be activated by pressing the live transcript button on the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. A member of the festival's team might contact webinar attendees for their feedback after the event. If they do not wish to be contacted, they should please email the festival's producer or a member of the festival's team to opt out of these communications. Email addresses can be found on the Sussex Festival of Ideas website. So we welcome questions. If people could please put these in the Q&A panel. Can you put these in as the event unfolds so we have a sense of how many questions we have? So please don't wait to the end so we don't have a kind of sudden flood of questions that we don't have an opportunity to answer. I want to say huge thanks to colleagues at the Attenborough Centre for the Creative Arts, where we are now, which is tremendously exciting. Bodies in a building, and with a live audience. Welcome, live audience. Hey! Like a lot of good things, this event grew out of a genuine and open conversation, initially with the wonderful Nicola Colby at Brighton Museum and Art Gallery, and then with Hedley Swain, who you'll be hearing more from as he's contributing today. We were interested in identifying some of the questions, some of the discussions, some of the issues that we were both interested in exploring, and it quickly became clear that questions of the decolonial and decolonisation felt particularly urgent within the context of Sussex and the context of the museum. Parts of the planning were informed by conversations with a PhD student at Sussex, Matt Jones, who heads up a postgraduate research group dealing with anti-racism and museum cultures. A large part of the preparation for this event in terms of Sussex took place in the context of the new liberal arts BA, which will launch next year. And I'm thrilled that Dr. Doug Haynes, who is the course leader for liberal arts, is going to be chairing the discussion. We have an external advisory board of industry experts who are feeding into plans for that degree, including colleagues from the Black Curriculum, who have played a kind of very active sense in shaping what this new degree should be. The degree takes really kind of pressing social issues as its focus and provides a kind of interdisciplinary interrogation of those. And in that sense, this event really exemplifies what that degree is setting out to do, both in terms of the issues with which we're engaging, but also the very outward-facing way in which we're going to explore them, drawing together academic researchers, activists, curators, teachers, to explore how we can work together to productively engage with what are a really pressing set of issues. So I will hand over to Doug Haynes. Thanks, Doug.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Well, welcome everyone to this session, investigating different aspects and contexts of decolonialisation and the notion of the decolonial. We'll be hearing from Orlene Badu, Hedley Swain, Sarah Lee and Vinita Damadaran over the course of this session. I'll give more details on each person just before they speak. But yes, hopefully what we'll be doing is getting different perspectives from different sectors, and people will introduce their take on what it is to think about decolonialism, and each person will do that. After that, we will have a conversation between the speakers, looking for points of contact, looking for things that work together. And during that time, hopefully questions will come in from people outside, from people in the room perhaps, from people who are watching online, and we can deal with questions. Please do send in questions. It'll be very interesting to hear from you. So As Ben said, I'm Doug Haynes. I'm currently the head of American Studies at the University of Sussex, but I'm the incoming head of liberal arts, which, as Ben has just explained, is an innovative new degree which will be thinking about these kinds of questions at an undergraduate level. And it's great to be able to have such great people around us to be able to speak about it now in this lovely sunny day on the campus here in Brighton. So the first speaker is Orlene Badu, who is an anti-racist system leader. Orlene has extensive senior leadership experience and was the head teacher at a diverse primary school in Hackney for 7 years. She also completed a secondment as head of a primary school, all through pupil referral unit. I've duffed that a little bit, I'm sorry. She curated the Hackney Diverse Curriculum Resources, 6 weekly units of work that were developed by highly skilled teachers and have been shared with schools locally, nationally and internationally. So I call upon Orlene Badu to tell us a little bit about her work.
Thank you, Doug. Yes, so I have worked in Hackney for a number of years, and I now work across a number of local authorities across London as well as beyond the UK, which obviously shows a drive for this work nationally as well as internationally. I think when we were creating the diverse resources in Hackney, it was really important to first of all just clarify what we meant by decolonialise the curriculum, as we recognised that actually that meant many different things for many different people. And also I think that politically there was some concern that decolonialisation meant removing topics from the national curriculum. So a lot of our work, first of all, was just to clarify what we mean by that. And by decolonialising our curriculum, we were talking about the opportunities within the national curriculum to identify the gaps and the silences, to find the spaces within which communities were not represented and to understand why, having a deeper knowledge of the context and being able to relate that and ask some really pertinent questions about why those gaps and silences were there. And what we did was we also wanted to make sure that our curriculum looked at a broad range of Black history, but also other topics as well, right across the curriculum. So we did a survey with parents who said actually we really don't want our children to continue learning about aspects of history that feel like narratives of oppression. We want our children to feel valued and celebrated. We want them to learn about what's fabulous about their culture, what are those cultural strengths that they have that they should use it within their lives and fall back on. So it's very much a reflection on kind of leaders, African kingdoms and a broad range of history. However, young people said to us it wasn't only I use the term archaic role models they wanted to know about, they wanted more recent role models as well. Who are those people in recent history, who are those people now, and also who are those people in the UK. They were very aware of civil rights leaders across the Atlantic and therefore didn't identify that they could do that role as well, that they could be activists and that they could impact on their own communities. So what we were trying to do was kind of remove what for many of our young people feels like passivity, feel like things are being done to them, and using the curriculum to empower them to know how to have an impact on their community. We talked about critical thinking being within there, and I can only imagine that would be really useful when they become university students to have those skills embedded from a very early age, being able to have a really strong sense of racial identity, and also if all young people have a strong sense of racial identity, they are capable of appreciating the racial identity of others and the cultural strengths of others. It was really important that we educated the teachers on how to do this work. So I did train the teachers on how to decolonise the curriculum, what were the aspects we were looking for. And as a result of that training that really asked them to think about those gaps and silences, they were able to create resources across the curriculum that meet the needs of pupils from 3 years old up until Key Stage 4. I think when people say to me, how do you think about legacies of empire? How do you teach that to primary and secondary age children? I think within looking for those gaps and silences and by understanding the context of why those gaps and silences are there, we then begin to pick up on those themes of legacies of empire. But also it's really important for us that young people see the legacies of that history today. And an example would be a Windrush unit that we have that looks at the Windrush scandal and talks about why there is still a legacy of that today. So I would say having a strong sense of belonging was a really important theme for us, and there were challenges which I can pick up in the questions, but I do think that it was about developing, I think in the Runnymede Trust they did a a piece of research on racism in secondary schools, and they really highlighted the importance of the racial literacy of staff, making sure that all teachers, irrespective of where they were trained, where they were educated, where they were born, when they work with young people, they have a secure understanding of race and racism in the UK and the impact for the pupils that they serve. And by doing that, it allowed them to drive and champion change in both the taught and the untaught curriculum. I think parental engagement was important for us, pupil engagement was important for us, but really it was about how do we ensure that our young people learn how to be activists, learn how to impact on their community, learn about their own cultural strengths. And interestingly, lots of people say to me, well, this is really important for children in a diverse community, and actually it's not, it's important for every child. If we are really keen to bring anti-racist leaders of the future through our education system, it's important that all children recognise the cultural strengths of all groups.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Orlene. Can I turn now to Hedley Swain? In October, Hedley Swain became the first CEO of the newly formed Royal Pavilion and Museums Trust here in Brighton. Prior to that, he was Area Director South East for Arts Council England and had previously worked at the Museum of London. Hedley is an honorary lecturer at UCL and a specialist in museums and archaeology. In 2005, he was responsible for writing UK government guidance on the care of human remains in museums that involved working with indigenous communities from around the world. So with that museum's perspective, I invite Hedley to speak. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. And again, I'd like to thank Ben and also my colleague Nicola for helping to organise today. It's lovely to be here. So as mentioned, our PMT, or the Royal Pavilion Museums Trust, came into being in October. I took up the post in November. We have inherited the Royal Pavilion and Brighton Museum, Hove Museum, Booth Museum and Preston Manor from Brighton Council, and we will be running it as an independent organisation. If we have been a bit silent in the last few months, hopefully that's to be expected. The staff were on furlough, the venues were closed, but we're all now back, and we look forward to welcoming the people of Brighton and indeed Sussex back to our venues as soon as possible. We have very major collections, including world art collections and collections from around the world. And I think it's fair to say all of our collections and all of our museums have their origins or roots in the imperial and colonial experience. I wrote a book on museums about 10 years ago, and very quickly you try to take a global perspective, and you realise very quickly museums are Western creation, and wherever you find museums in the world, they've almost always started from an imperialist or Western background. There's no getting away from that. Of our sites, arguably the Royal Pavilion is the most blatant in its imperial references. You know, a mashup of Indian, imperial, British, Chinese designs, conceived and built at the exact moment when Britain became the preeminent global power following the defeat of Napoleon in Europe, and as the East India Company established its dominance in India and began to take an interest in China. If you were to be slightly more benign, you would say it came out of an enlightenment fascination with those cultures and a fascination with the East, and I think that's an interesting discussion to have. I'd like to think, and this was very much before my time, and indeed, Sarah has more involvement in it with me as I'm relatively new. I'd like to say that Brighton Museums have got a very good track record in equitable and diverse working that respects communities and enters into true partnerships. There's a good track record with work, for example, that we've done with the LGBTQI community in Brighton with things like the Museum of Transology and Queering the Pier that's there at the Brighton Museum at the moment. We've also done very important work in partnership with African collections and African museums, including work on African fashion, which Sarah was very involved in, and I thank her for that. We've also told the story of Indian soldiers at the Pavilion in World War I, and that again is a powerful story that's very important to us. So huge credit to our staff and people who've worked them in the past, and I must also thank the James Hedley Green Trust that supported a lot of our work. However, I would say, as with all museums, I've been the first to admit that most of our work has been project-based, has been a bit piecemeal and a bit sporadic. And even now, if I'm honest, we're finding pockets of casually racist material in our exhibitions and our collections and our displays that need addressing. Doug's already mentioned my personal journey in terms of diversity and equality. In 2005, I worked for the British government in trying to come up with guidance for the repatriation of human remains, which often involved absolutely appalling wrongdoing to indigenous communities in the late 19th and early 20th century. The collection of Aboriginal skulls and Aboriginal skeletons to back up a very pseudo-scientific theory of Western superiority that absolutely horrified me at the time and has influenced me ever since. In 2006, I worked on the Sugar and Slavery Gallery at the Museum of Docklands, which was to commemorate the bicentenary of the banning of transatlantic slavery. We were very proud of ourselves. We communicated and consulted widely, but every day I walked past a statue outside the museum of a white slave owner, and at the time we didn't think about it at all, and it shocked me last year, you know, when that came up. So that sense of the journey we're all on. And then, as mentioned, most recently I worked for the Arts Council England. And our Arts Council England, we promoted a very powerful, creative case for diversity, arguing strongly that arts and culture that is truly diverse, in terms of its production and its audience and its creativity, is not just morally, legally and economically the right thing to do, but you get greater art from it. It's better art, and I believe that incredibly strongly. So at Brighton Museum, we do have a track record. I'd like to say I've got a reasonable track record, plenty to be smug about if you like, but like so many other white liberals, I was forced to confront my failings last spring with the realisation that for all our good thoughts and deeds, we'd moved far too slowly, without truly listening and without truly sharing power. And now, obviously, we need to confront that. As we hopefully emerge from COVID, we at RPMT will be redoubling our efforts to focus around a program that we're calling Culture Change RPMT, or Culture Change Royal Pavilion Museums Trust, again generously supported by the James Henry Green Trust. We will seek to take the good work that we've done in the past with our world art collections and our good practice and attempt to embed it holistically across the whole organisation. So everything we do is truly equitable and attempts to be anti-racist. This will include how we collect and interpret collections, how we recruit and develop staff, how we seek to engage with others and listen to external voices, and how we work with partners. In addition, we're also attempting to create a board of trustees that begin to truly reflect our audiences and our diversity, and I'm really pleased that Atia Gule, one of our new trustees, is with us today, and it's great the support she's already giving me. We will also continue to work closely with partners and stakeholders, and of those, Sussex University and indeed Brighton University will be absolutely important, and we look forward to those important partnerships. We know that we still have much to do. We have got a roadmap. Sharing power, listening must be a key part of that. There is much I can see we can do that is positive, and I think we can be an example of good progressive museum service. But the external environment is still not conducive to making all the changes we would want. And we only need to look at the news in the last few days. The Rhodes statue in Oxford, the picture of the Queen in Oxford, the English cricketer being sacked for racist tweets, but then supported by a Prime Minister and a Secretary of State, and the booing of English football fans just show us that the job is not done. In fact, the job is arguably only just beginning, and why it's so important that all of us go forward together. It's no good. Museums can't solve this, universities can't solve this, schools can't solve this. We all have to work together, and that's why an event like this, and us all moving forward, shoulder to shoulder, arm in arm, is the way forward. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So So I'd like to welcome our next speaker, Sarah Lee, who is a heritage consultant and Black history activist. Sarah is the co-founder of Brighton and Hove Black History, and she's been engaged in anti-racist project work for nearly 20 years. She's also a highly experienced heritage consultant and has worked for the Heritage Lottery Fund and Brighton and Hove Museum, most recently on developing the Brighton and Hove Museum's highly successful BME Heritage Network. She also facilitated the collection, panel and community engagement strand for the Fashion Cities Africa exhibition for Brighton Museum in 2016, which was the first major UK exhibition dedicated to contemporary African fashion. Sarah is also an academic consultant and a writer, and I hand over to you now. Thank you.
Thank you, Doug. Thank you for that. Gosh, I've forgotten I'd written all that.
Yeah,
It's quite a lot, isn't it?
The African fashion thing sounds fantastic.
Yes, that was, yeah. So thank you for that. And it's great to be here, and slightly strange to be in the world with real people. I'm still slightly pinching myself to see, is this a dream? And will I wake up at some point and realise
Yes,
it's
it
a dream?
is.
But yeah, I just would like to make some observations really for a few minutes based on being in this strange position of being, as we just said earlier, being both the gamekeeper and the poacher. So being someone who is sitting in multiple worlds, which is what I've done for the last 20 years really. And what perspective that might throw on the concept of decolonising the curriculum and decolonial perspectives. The first thing I would say is I have to confess I have quite an ambivalent relationship to the term decolonising the museum or decolonial perspectives, and that's born out of, I think, two things really. One is the fact that when we set up Black History 20 years ago, that word didn't exist, and we were still effectively doing that work at the museum before this word exists, and now this word has become something that has become the doyen of hashtag culture, and it's become a thing a little bit like Me Too, or it's become another thing that's part of meme culture, and that troubles me. I have to say that really does trouble me. I'm also sincerely impressed and gratified that museums are beginning, as Hedley's mentioned so eloquently, to start looking at their collections and their provenance and looking at that relationship. But within that, I have an abiding uncertainty about what this term gives us, and whether it's actually in some ways, is it enabling, or is it also in some ways quite reifying and quite reductive to be using that. I think partly it's about the term itself, decolonial, so just stripping away. I think what I find most useful out of it is how it makes us think about positionality and in terms of perspectives. So where one sits in relation to colonial practice is about where you come from, where I come from as a mixed race Jamaican woman with Manchester, Chinese, with a lot of different ethnic bits to me, and someone who has a very different perspective and what that means, because I'm basically experiencing it from a very different perspective. I think the other issue, and I've got to be frank about it, is our Black History group, which I've been doing for 22 years. We have been, I have to say, a little bit miffed by the amount of attention and suddenly feeling like one is the flavour of the month since Black Lives Matter. And the last 2 years there's been an explosion of people wanting to give us money, suddenly being interested in engaging with us. I won't mention who it is, but one of our volunteers suddenly was invited, in fact, consciously encouraged to take some space in a gallery that previously she's been knocking on their door for about 10 years and had no joy whatsoever, and suddenly they've said, please come in, we want you to be part of our programme for the next, please do this, something around George Floyd. Can you do that? Can you do it for us in October? Could you possibly do it for us in October? And it's like, oh right, okay, here we go again. And so within that, one feels a little bit used and a little bit, it feels quite instrumental, and that also troubles me. Just a couple of other observations based on the work that Hedley's raised. I think the Brighton Museum has been exemplary, particularly the work that Helen Mears has done there in terms of engaging communities with collections. What we've done long before, we have basically looked at those collections and examined them from different perspectives, from the diaspora communities from which they were pillaged, but also about how the museum as itself as a space is welcoming or not for Black communities, and also for people who don't necessarily engage with museums, which are, as Hedley's already said, an inherently Western and a very colonial institution. So I think that work has been going on. So I suppose my question really would be, what does this word give us that we weren't already doing? Okay, it perhaps might make us think about the process by which we think about a museum and a collection, but I'm also wondering about how much that bifurcation of, you know, what I've seen in the Financial Times, a hideous article about woke culture, and I absolutely loathe this world of hashtags. I loathe it. I just think it makes people not think. It makes people think about things in terms of how many Instagram. We need to separate the value of this word, and I would say recover it for something that's genuinely useful rather than something that's just about a particular type of the visual culture that we currently inherit. So those are just my suggestions of things it'd be great to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll talk about them, I think we will. Thank you so much. So our final speaker is Vinita Damadaran, who's a professor and a historian of modern India at the University of Sussex, interested in sustainable development dialogues in the global south. Her publications include Post-Colonial India, History, Politics and Culture from 2000, and Commonwealth Forestry and Environmental History, Empire, Forests and Colonial Environments in Africa, the Caribbean, South Africa and New Zealand from 2020, so just last year. Vinita is the director of the Centre for World Environmental History at Sussex and is currently working on a project to decolonise the natural history collections of the British Empire. That sounds very big. I applaud you for that. But working with Kew and with the Natural History Museum, and thank you very much for being here. I hand over to you, Vinita.
Thank you very much. It gives me great honor to be calling, a teacher and two professional museum specialists. So what I'll be doing today is telling you a little bit, and I've been asked to do this by our host, a little bit about the project, how actually this works in practice, not just in the context of Britain, but how a decolonizing project actually works in practice in the context of India. And I'll be talking particularly about the project that I'm currently engaged in. Bear with me, I will only take 7 minutes, which is the decolonizing the natural history collections of Empire, which, as you correctly say, is a very, very broad term. So what are these collections? So if you travel to the Natural History Museum or Kew today, where do the largest collections come from? Have a guess. Anyone? India, absolutely. So the wealth of botanical and environmental knowledge that you have is being collected from the 17th to the 19th centuries, and they are housed very much both in India and in Britain in particular. And in India, of course, they are housed in very fragile and endangered archives. And what we are doing at Sussex, and this is again quite important, the Centre for World Environmental History, is working with partners, and this is mainly Kew, the Natural History Museum, the British Library, the Edinburgh Botanic Garden, not only to digitize these archives and repatriate them, so that's one way of decolonizing it, and also to integrate these collections, which are housed in different museums, including in Calcutta, to the horror of some of the Kew archivists in decaying conditions, and to facilitate projects that allow the use of information that is based on these collections, and also to bring audiences in India and make them alert not only to the collections that they have in Calcutta, for example, but also in Britain. So next slide, please. Yeah. So it's an extraordinarily diverse archive. It's got information on landscape features. Given the fact that we are, in a climate change context, this is an extremely important archive. And as a historian based at Sussex, we've got the ability of bringing together all this information and in some senses allowing this information to be shared with communities and students in places like Bengal. The next slide, please. Yeah. So that's a little bit about the centre, which was started the Centre of Excellence, and it's got these very interesting partners. Next slide, please. So we've got about 90 members now, which are mainly spread out from all over the world, South and Southeast Asia, Africa, particularly in South Africa, and of course in Australia and Canada. So it's a very exciting network that we've sort of created. Next slide, please. And the main work that we are doing is around the Calcutta Botanic Garden and repatriating archives, which are based, as I said, in Kew, in the Natural History Museum, back to Calcutta, where they're sort of engaged in doing the new flora of India. And interestingly, there's no new flora of India since 1870, since Hooker's project, right? But we are also, and this goes back to your point about positionality, looking at the way in which these archives were created and constructed. And next slide, please. So, for example, in the 17th century, you had a much more sort of all-inclusive way in which these collections happened. And Van Breda, who was a Dutch collector, composed this Hortus Malabaricus from the region where I come from, and he sort of embraced indigenous knowledge, right? And 17th century collecting was very different, and you can see some of the images that he collected. Next slide, please. So that's the coconut tree. The next slide, please. Tenga, which is indigenous nomenclature, was used in the Hortus Malabaricus. And then when you come to the 19th century, we have a very different form of collection, which is much more Victorian high imperialism. Joseph Dalton Hooker, does anyone know what he's important for? Anyone has rhododendrons in their garden? Well, rhododendrons, yes. He brought back the rhododendron back from the Himalayas for us. So we had a transcription project. His work was extremely important for understanding the environmental history of India. So we tried to match collections to correspondence. We highlighted the importance of this collection to Q. And this was a very exciting project that we sort of did. Next slide, please. And we produced a high-quality digital edition, which was encoded in TI compliant, fully searchable, by animal, family, plant species, and genus. Next slide, please. So also we were able to highlight the prejudices of plant collecting. So here is a man who's traveling in the Himalayas collecting rhododendrons for us, among other things, and of course very dismissive of indigenous nomenclature. Next slide, please. So here he is with the lectures of Sikkim, completely denigrating the way in which their indigenous nomenclature fed into plant collection. So he talks about, he romanticizes them, my lectures, but at the same time he's quite denigrating. Next slide, please. So what we've done then is to highlight the importance of these collections in various ways by saving them in the context of the Calcutta, the Wallet collection, which was a late 18th century botanical collection, which was disintegrating in Calcutta, bringing them and integrating them with collections at Kew and the Natural History Museum, which was a very, very important project. Next slide, please. And then when we came to the 20th century, we highlighted the role of an Indian woman scientist who was extremely neglected and who was quite important in Britain, right? So how many of us know that she was the first female employee of the Royal Horticultural Society, right? She's invisible until I raised this in the RHS website, right? The first in the 1940s. Next slide, please. So she was an eminent botanist writing in Nature, working on bamboo and zea crosses. I'm honored that she was a great aunt of my mother's, so I'm very pleased that happened. And here are her letters sort of conserved in the Bodleian, because she wrote to an eminent biologist and sadly eugenicist, Darlington, and those are her letters preserved. And as I said here, she was the first female employee of the Royal Empire. So next slide, please. And you can see her Magnolia cobus in Battleson Hill in the RHS. Next slide, please. So we assembled all these sort of very interesting ideas and collections, and we forced Kew to take this exhibition to India in 2016 and 17. And this was an already curated exhibition which we took to India, and you can see the wonderful Gina Fuller Love there in that image. Next slide, please. And we supplemented this and co-curated it with the Botanical Survey of India, which is a very bureaucratic organization in Calcutta, which needs to be decolonized itself, right? And again, letting you know about how you can decolonize. Next slide, please. And we brought in school children, right? So, and for the first time, Indian scientists were able to open up their collections, which they had never done, to school students, rather than just, thinking about their collections, moth-eaten though they were, that they could only sort of link. And we produced information leaflets in English and Bengali. Next slide, please. And then another aspect of our project was to get the Natural History Museum, which was funded by the Rutherford, to send about 300,000 plant specimens back to India. And we got some Indian scientists to do this, and this is there on their website. And I'm coming to the last couple of slides. Yes, please. Next slide, please. And this is the last slide. The final project we're trying to do is to restore Roxburgh's herbarium. He was one of the directors of the Calcutta Botanic Garden, and you might say this is an imperial heritage, and I'd like to hear the views of the audience, whether we should restore this. It's very much on the lines of the Kew archive, so it's got very much a similar staircase, and it's got amazing architectural features. So we're currently engaged with the Asia Scotland Trust to restore this, which might be a worthwhile endeavor, and I'll leave you there. 7 minutes?
Thank you very much. You don't always think about plants as being the sort of subject of the primary extraction that colony is usually sort of thought of in the sort of first stages of colony, but that really shows a lot about that, I think. So this next part of the session, I think, should be speakers kind of speaking to each other. But Sarah, you have introduced some some interesting questions that I think we can't ignore and we should sort of follow up on. And certainly we've been thinking about that in preparation for the session itself. So this is the kind of questioning of the term, I guess, the decolonialization, decolonisation, various ways that you can talk about it. When I was doing my PhD, it was post-colonialism. That was the idiom, that was the paradigm that would sort of deal with these kinds of questions. And while the tense of that always seems a bit strange, what's post about colonialism necessarily, this kind of moved to decolonialism, to the decolony. I think we should just reflect on it for a little while. We're talking about it as though it was something that was just really natural and obvious and as clear and transparent as a window, but it isn't. And obviously it's different in each case. Each person here is from a different context and it means something slightly different. So maybe we could think about whether it's a productive term or a sort of obstructive kind of term. I mean, Sarah, I don't know if you would like to just say a little bit more. And I know that your talk was kind of around questioning those things, but whether to sort of lead it in a little bit so that other people can react a tiny bit more.
Sure, yeah. I suppose it's because, as I was saying, the work had already been going on prior to the term getting sort of prevalence within discourse, and that's what. And being a word person and someone who's very much aware of the structures around which words are. Create certain meaning senses, I'm very concerned that the word decolonial is quite a limiting. It's basically suggests something being extracted out of something. That you can somehow brush things anew by removing the colonial infrastructure around a museum, which in itself is impossible. And I would see this as a much more iterative process around engagement, confrontation. And I'm not sure necessarily how much it's serving the cause, if you like, in terms of the cultural backlashes that we are seeing around the use of that term at the moment. Okay. So my question would be, perhaps the other panel members, what your feelings are, because this is the term around which we're all invited to speak.
Yes, thank you.
So yeah, I would agree with you. I mean, how you work through this colonial legacy, which is what this plant collection project has done. So you can work through it, for example, by having an exhibition that Q had, for example, here. But working through it in a very different context and completely changing its meanings, where this iterative process, I would totally agree with you, Sarah, that it has to be engaged beyond.
Can I just ask what we mean by iterative process? I'm just for the benefit of the girls and boys out there.
I mean, I say what I think, perhaps Vinita can then respond, but for me it's about the idea that because I'm seeing because I do think that the visual cultures that currently exist within our society around social media tend to reduce and strip out meaning into gestures. I do feel that within the process of decolonising, we've seen a lot of focus of that around the Colston statue and about these things that are emblematic and gestural. And I'm just wondering where therefore iterative to me is a process like we've been doing in the museum, where we come and go, we accept the faults, we might have an event around the museum, we then resolve that and engage with it, and it's not just one act, one gesture, one process. So to me, it's about that's what I'm.
I would say it's about engagement. It's about co-construction. It's changing the meaning in a new context, and that precisely is what one has tried to do. And I think it works completely differently in different contexts. Especially with this housing this exhibition in Kew, which is a sort of still an imperial organisation. And taking it to the decaying gallery in Calcutta was a very different experience for me. And having school children that interpret it was again a very, very interesting experience.
Yeah, Orlene, can we decolonise? Is it possible to to extract, to strip out? I mean, I wonder if this is the problem that we're having. That it's not something that can just be juggled out like that.
Yeah, I mean, I don't see it as extraction personally in terms of my role. I think it's very much about being informed and understanding legacies that potentially our history hasn't allowed us to understand, particularly if we talk about primary and secondary education. So, I mean, I quite like the hashtags, so that's only because I think we're beginning to speak in a way that young people can engage with, and I think it can feel limited, but I think it's important that we speak in a way that young people can engage with this discussion. So, and I know that there have been many conversations with young people post-summer 2020, calling on their schools to decolonise their curriculums, calling on their schools to think about what they study for GCSE, calling on their schools to give special attention to their experiences in the education system. And I think that the backlash is probably because we're heading in the right direction. And I feel like the backlash is very much about, hang on, this is going to disrupt cycles. And actually we've had a very long time of propagating cycles of inequality. I also think the term, whilst challenging, actually allows us to teach young people, look at all these terms that have come over the ages. So this is not the first part of history where we've challenged colonialism, and young people understanding that actually there have been a sequence of events across time, and it's important for them to understand that and think about why they've come and gone, why some have been tokenistic, why there's been what has happened, and how do we make sure that this time around we try and sort of learn from those experiences. So I think for young people, it's a term that they can engage with, and I think it's a term that they are actively looking to challenge systems. And it's been young people across the board that we've seen in Hackney that are challenging and questioning on behalf of themselves, but also as allies as well.
You mentioned in your talk that when thinking about the curriculum, that in order to include the things that you need, the things to represent, to fill in the silences and the gaps, other things would have to be lost in a way. So is there a sense in that of a kind of, not extraction, but a rebalancing in a sense?
So I think politically, people would like to think that there's an extraction, that you can't learn everything there is to learn within the national curriculum and pay attention to those gaps and silences. But I think that the part of the work that we're doing is showing that actually you can do both. You can absolutely stick to what is on the agenda. It's also understanding that 20% of the curriculum should be local history as well, which seems to have been forgotten because we're in very data-driven times and schools have targets to meet. So it's using that 20% of your curriculum to think about local history, but it's also looking at the gaps and silences, but also comparing and contrasting. If you've been given a particular leader to look at, compare that to somebody of the time who was a leader for very different reasons, for different societies, and talk about the differences and the similarities. So I think there are many opportunities, but if you have school leaders that don't support the work, or if you have less time to develop your subject knowledge, then that becomes a very challenging task.
Yeah, I can imagine. Maybe we can come around to some of these sort of ideas about resistance maybe a bit later on. But yeah, Hedley, I know that we talked this bit before.
So I think, firstly, you know, the genie is out of the box. You know, we live in the world with this this kind of culture, and if we can use it, then great. But I sympathise absolutely with this point, and it's why in making the point for what we're going to try and do at Brighton Museums is a holistic approach, and for me, decolonizing is a subset of something far bigger, which is about power. It's about sharing power and empowerment, and it's about listening, and we need to be, you know, there's a responsibility on all of us that we're not sucked into just talking about decolonizing collections, but we're talking about this thing about sharing power and truly listening and truly sharing power. However, for me, there is something that does. We do need to go through a kind of cleansing exercise. We do need to clean out. To have not, you know, the language you use here and the analogies, but the sense of, you know, we've got, our veins are clogged with an approach which does come out of colonialism, does come out of a white male-dominated Western view of the world, and we do need to clean that out in some way to move on. So I agree absolutely that we need to be very careful that we don't reduce it down. We also need to be very careful that we don't fall into traps of the past, that we allow this to be captured by the other side and used against us. I'll never forget, the whole idea of being politically correct, that was a creation of the American right. We need to be very careful that we fight our battles on our battlefields. But I do think that part of this process is about cleaning out and cleansing and decolonizing. Something. There is something that needs de-ing.
Yeah, that's what, so to speak. I realise I said something earlier on that was. Okay. So I don't want to use a rather unfashionable notion of something dialectical, but the way that two things that cannot be kind of disentangled from one another seem to be kind of at work at all times in this discussion. I think the other point that you made, Sarah, that your dislike of the hashtag and the sort of popular, populist, global, overly general, Insta-friendly kind of approach to important questions is. I mean, I totally take your point, but I wonder if you could just go around again and think about, is that an entirely negative thing, or is there is it useful in some ways to galvanise people if we're talking about persuading lots of people and getting lots of people into the game and thinking about it? Is it such a bad thing that it happens in this, somewhat scattershot type of way? I wonder. That's just a question for everyone. I know it's not a very sort of sharp question, but I think it's worth thinking about.
We actually agree with each other around. I totally relate to your point about the fact that it means young people engage, and young people engage with history perhaps through a hashtag or through a Black Lives Matter. And I use hashtags. I'm a fugitive, so it's not that I'm a Luddite refusionist of social media, but I suppose because I'm very passionate about media studies and media literacy, I just feel that part of this process should be teaching people about what gestural politics means. And so yes, do engage them, do get them to think. And it is great that young people, and I've worked in Peru, so I know how disengaged those kids are, particularly in inner city London, where there's no hope. But for people to feel that someone's speaking to them and looks like them and is relating to them is so profoundly important. But within that, it would just be really great to give people some degree of literacy around when you use a hashtag, what does that mean? What does that say around? Just give people some awareness that being something that's an Insta-friendly post carries a whole set of assumptions within it, that it would be really great if they could unpack those, as well as also feeling finally someone speaking their language. But I think I completely agree with you, we need to use it, but perhaps in a way that allows them more power and agency within that, I think would be great to see.
Yeah, I think sense of agency is particularly important for young people, particularly in the areas that I work in. And I also think it's about, so a lot of the work that I see happening at the moment makes me feel heartened, but I can never leave without that question of, so tell me the roadmap, what's the long game? Because I think what we're worried about is that actually this is it's moving very quickly, and it's something that we can all engage with now, and the hashtag supports that, but let's not, what's the journey, what's the long game in all of this, what's your roadmap to decolonising, or what's your roadmap to ensuring balance of power, and who is the onus on for balance of power? Because I find there's a lot of training at the moment about personal responsibility and how we redress those power balances, and less about policies and practices that ensure that those power balances are addressed. And I think as long as it's on the individual's responsibility, it's less likely to be long-term, and it's less likely to have the long-term impacts we're hoping for. So very much, how do we redress that balance in a way that is going to go beyond our tenure? Because that's what's happened in the past. There are waves of anti-racism, and then it's how do we learn from that to make sure that now it goes beyond our tenure and is part of the ongoing legacy.
No, I welcome this in some senses, because precisely when I started this work 20 years ago or so, nobody was talking about decoloniality. And so in some senses it's refreshing, because you go to these museums, and these are foreign spaces the footfall in these museums is now going to come from young people of a different colour, whose parents have probably come from somewhere else, And this is going to be your new audience. So how are you going to be addressing this new audience now? How are you going to make this relevant, isn't it? That's the way in which these collections, which I'm working with, have to be made much more relevant. Q and the NHM need to make them much more acceptable. I was in the V&A yesterday where I was looking at the jewelry collections and came across this entire cachet of the jewels of Tipu Sultan, you know, which were taken. I mean, it had a very small sort of inscription there saying, these are the Seringapatam jewels. Now this is very, very interesting. I mean, the death of Tipu in the late 18th century heralded a whole period of loot, you know. The word loot comes from India, right? So it would be very interesting to actually document this in terms of these collections, and I would like to see it much more visible than it is now. Or the Leeds manufacturer and a gallery there who made his money from cotton based on the deindustrialization of India, right? So yes, you know, people need to be engaged, children need to be engaged in different forms of narratives and different stories. And I'd like to see more of that in British museums. Yeah.
And is there something interesting about the kind of globalizing nature of things like hashtags? I mean, sort of the speed with which kind of messages go around the world. I mean, this is, you know, if you know the era of empire was the kind of era of a certain kind of globalization, this is a different kind of globalization, isn't it? I wonder if that's, is there something we can say about that? How things that happen in America obviously affect things that are happening here. Is that, I mean, I don't know if anyone wants to think about that. Still working on this notion of the hashtag and how that is such a big player now in thinking about these debates. So its global nature. Is that
so it's about interconnected histories, you know. I mean, the more you talk about this is not, so you know, the jewelry is labelled as British jewelry, right? Okay, it was refashioned and made in Britain, right? So it is, but you know, the jewelry actually, it is a product of a loot, right? So, you know, how is it British, you know? You know, so it's, I'm not saying you have to be nationalist about this, but at the same time, it's about how India feeds into the whole art of jewelry making from 1800, you know. So it's those sort of narratives which I think are about interconnected history. It's about the global history of commodity exchange, which I think museums are trying to do now in a much more interesting and useful way. But perhaps need to talk about the possibilities, the hidden narratives there that are, I suppose, that's what would be useful.
I think for young people as well, it's that idea of interconnected history, but also interconnected inequality. So, you know, having experienced a pandemic and still experiencing, the research says that the first thing that gets highlighted is how unequal a society is. And when you have that globally, and I think that suddenly the world feels much smaller because we recognise that there is so much inequality. You know, we are currently in the third most unequal society in the world, and what that means to young people who have never really engaged with that and now are being faced with that. And I think that interconnectedness globally is part of what comes through in our curriculum as well, in terms of them understanding that yes, there are local issues to concern ourselves with, but we are very interconnected with the rest of the world, and they've suddenly realised through all the demonstrations that have happened that actually this inequality that they may be experiencing is being experienced on a wide scale, linked to a post-colonial world, and you know, so actually what we're doing is they feel much more informed, and I think it's important to ensure that whenever people say to me, well, why are we talking about what's happening in the US? Actually, because we're so interconnected, and this pandemic has helped us to understand how small the world is and how interconnected we are, and the importance of understanding that. Yeah, and creating affiliations that perhaps weren't possible before as well. I don't know if you like to address this over here.
I think I think that there's a real, I really relate to what you're saying around that interconnectedness and about that plurality of experience being replicated and more visible perhaps in social media. I would also take us back to what we were saying about visibility around our experiences as black or mixed heritage people growing up in the UK. I can only speak for myself, but I know that I always wanted to find people who looked like me, who had my story, my experience, and I couldn't find them. I couldn't find them in books, I couldn't find them in museums, I couldn't find them in my curriculum. I applaud you for the fact that you're doing that now, because I feel that it's this sense, and this is something when we were doing the work with Brighton Museum, Hedley, that when we did focus groups and work with community groups, they were saying no one looks like me. The only black person is the security guard on the door. And going into somewhere where no one looks like you is profound. You know, everywhere I go, I notice if there's any other black people in the room. Always. And this is something that I think about all the time. I'm conscious of it all the time. And I think that need to have that connection, that aha moment, is something that we can see in social media, but it's also equally important in the spaces that these heritage institutions inherit. So that's something I'd love to see continue.
Yes, that's a good
well,
segue.
I mean, you know, I'd be the first to admit with the museum sector that we have a long journey to go on, and we have to be absolutely honest about that. Our people, on the whole, are of a very particular background. And we have to work on that, and it will take time. And we have to get to the stage where, as you say, you feel completely comfortable. In fact, we need to go further. And it's the point I made about the idea of the creative case. That I've always found that when you have a group of very different people in the room, it is more creative. And if you have a group of people who are the same, it isn't. And we have to work on that. And we have to admit that it will take time in terms of museum staff, and therefore we have to find shortcuts. And therefore, working in partnership is the first way. Truly listening, bringing in community groups and empowering them. So you know, there's an old-fashioned approach where you work with a community group, and then you say, well, who's actually being paid in this room to do this? You know, and the idea that if someone's around the table, they have equal value and they should be equally paid. So there's lots of things we can do. And to start with the recognition that we're a long way from there at the moment.
Can I just make a plea, coming on what you just said about inequality and partnerships, that you're actually not just you're thinking of partnerships across the global south. That you're thinking of linking up with museums and with organizations and this is a digital age. We can actually do this. And thinking creatively, and university spaces like this can also facilitate that, both in terms of the curriculum and in terms of...
And to be fair, absolutely, you know, and again, Brighton has a good record, a good start. We've got a good partnership in Botswana. But you're absolutely right. That's how we need to do it. And of course, there's great partnerships at an academic level, but we need to get down below those. And that is a way where we can make real progress. We need to be. It's a bit of a get out of jail for some museums when it comes to repatriation and decolonialisation. We won't give you your objects back, but we'll have a partnership with you. And
we'll lend them back to you.
Yeah, we'll lend. You know, those objects we stole from you, we'll lend them back to you.
That actually has happened. That does happen. Yeah.
It has. But that's not to say you're absolutely right. But that all, you know, let's build partnerships. Well, and it's always the thing. You know, all of us will know there are partnerships and there are partnerships. And you know, I don't know if anyone's ever worked with the BBC, but the number of times, we'll partner you, which normally means we'll roll over you and do whatever we want, you know. And you know, finding true partnerships and being honest to that and having the rules of engagement that are true. But I absolutely agree.
Maybe sort of thinking of the obverse of partnership, and thinking back to the idea of getting people involved in this, there's also that idea of resistance of people who don't want it to happen, who don't like this idea, you know, which we see played out in all sorts of different situations. And since everyone is from a slightly different context, I wondered if you would want to think about, you know, what does resistance to your project look like, and what do you do about it? What do we do about it? What kind of forms does it take that you've experienced in particular? I don't know if anyone would like to go on that. Yeah, I can feel that you do want to say something.
I think because it's a common, it's something that we probably all confront quite a lot at the moment. And I've got a very blunt answer as to why that resistance exists. And I think you can only resist it if you are a beneficiary of the current system. So if you are a beneficiary of the current system and you are unwilling to have any understanding as an ally of what different groups in the UK are experiencing, or your racial literacy means that you don't know enough to make those decisions, I think therefore you will then continue just to propagate that system. So for me, I'm very aware of and it comes back to the idea of anti-racism, which is an active role. It's an active disruption. again, probably another hashtag that we'll have to consider going forward. But I think it's an active role in whatever form it takes. And I think those who resist at the moment potentially either are a beneficiary of that system, but I also know that there are many school leaders that I've engaged with that are resistant out of fear, because there's a very hostile environment at the moment that says you can't do both. You can't decolonise your curriculum and meet expectations. You can't decolonise your curriculum and do really well academically. So there is a fear that actually if we can't do that, we're just going to have to stick to what we know. And I think part of my role is helping school leaders to understand that actually I can do both, and that actually my children potentially will do much better as a result of having a curriculum that they are motivated by, that they see themselves within, and that pushes them and drives them to affect change.
No, that sounds really interesting. But I was also thinking about, yes, people who are benefiting from the kind of status quo obviously are resistant to changes to it. But there are other people who kind of affiliate themselves with, being a beneficiary of the status quo. And we saw that with the Colston statue. We see that with people who defend the status quo, even though they've never really been beneficiaries of any version of the regime from which this has come. And I know that this is, I don't want to open up this can of worms too much, but that does seem like a very big kind of body of resistance out there for this kind of project.
Yeah, because I also think there is that worry that if you put your head above the parapet and go against what is the status quo, there's fear there again. So actually sometimes it's safer to say what everybody else is saying, to conformity bias. I'm just going to go with what the group status is saying. But I think it's education. And I think in order to develop our racial literacy, to be able to have these powerful conversations about change, we need to educate one another about race and racism in the UK. And without that, I think you will continue to have that resistance.
Okay, yeah. Would anyone else care to share their experiences of resistance?
As long as there are people like her around, we are going the right way. Absolutely. But shall I tell you? I mean, I've been in this, here in this university in Britain for over 30 years, and we are still pushing at a closed door. Right? It's not an open door, and it sometimes shocks me about how closed we are. We don't see our interconnected history. This is still an island story that we are telling and retelling. And there's still a hubris of empire. And how do you challenge that? I mean, I just walk away, I'm now old, and I am tempted to walk away. So it's refreshing to have people like you here. It's refreshing to see that, there is this movement going on now. It's probably too late for people like me to actually benefit from it, but in an institutional sense, I meant. Yes. My children will.
I think it is depressing, and I think this is pretty basic stuff, and it is about fear and power, and fear of losing power in a perhaps defensible way, but also in that about something about an unknown you don't understand. But there is also just that quite nasty, visceral. I don't want to lose power here, and it is depressing. And I think, as I mentioned, some of the things we're seeing now have really jolted me. In that, we sometimes do appear to be going backwards, and this sense that we thought we were making. I've grown up all my life thinking, well, there've been bad times, but incrementally, gradually, we're heading in the right direction. And they said, well, I'm not sure we are anymore, and that's kind of really, really scary. And it's why, so all credit to Sussex University. The idea of we've got to pull together, we've got to work together. We can't do this in isolation. And if you're in a museum, you think you're at the most important place in the world. You're really not, And universities are probably a little bit more important, but still. But actually schools, incredibly important. And if universities and museums can help schools, then perhaps we can make progress.
I'll just reiterate what other people have said around power and fear. But just then, when you were talking, Hedley, I was minded of people in my family. I think there's this whole issue around the fact that we're living through such straitened, emotionally emaciated times that I've noticed, for example, in my family, which is full of multiple immigrants, I've heard people in my family saying, I don't like immigrants. Who are immigrants? That's actually happened twice. where I've heard people, one lady who was a Tamil lady talking about her dislike of immigrants moving into her area, and she'd been in Britain for 20 years. People in my family in Manchester talking about all the immigrants that they don't like, and they don't like them even though their children are mixed race, and they actually have children who are the product of immigrants. And I think it's actually really complex. It isn't just them and us around. There's the people out there who are really, really full of fear and part of the social underclass. It's also about this sense of people wishing to belong, and how people process this notion of other, and those who belong and those that don't. Because if someone who's an immigrant to talk about their dislike of immigrants, who's perfectly intelligent, that's actually quite frightening, and that really needs unpacking, I think. So there's a lot going on around why these conversations are happening.
Around belonging and
Belonging,
identity is really kind of crucial terms, aren't they?
When I was at the Museum of London about 15 years ago, we thought we'd do a project on popular protest and popular uprising, in the idea that it would be a very uplifting project. And you scratch the surface, almost vast majority of popular movements have been reactionary. Exactly that. We don't like change. We don't like something that's new. We don't like, what the new people who moved in around the block far outweighed the more positive ones, depressingly.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Yeah, we have questions from what we could call the outside. beyond this, is that right? From beyond this room.
Okay, so the first one, this came in immediately after Orlene's talk, so it's for Orlene, but I think it can apply more broadly. What, if any, support have you gained and or are gaining from the government on this important addition to the curriculum? But I guess this kind of speaks to government bodies, local councils, kind of people with whom on whom you're relying for funding, governance, and so on. So I think it'd be open to the panel more broadly, but maybe for Orlene first of all.
I can answer that very quickly. I can say none. I think there have been people in my local authority that have, including councillors, that have kind of written and asked for change. And whilst the work that we have done shows that you can do it within the current national curriculum, we recognise that there are limitations and we would want it to go further. But that hasn't happened, and there is that kind of the responsibility gets put back on the teachers' shoulders, who have already been told that you shouldn't decolonise, but now actually if you do, it's your responsibility, and kind of the challenge that presents. I do think that there is more that could be done, but one of the things that makes me really proud about being an educator is that education doesn't wait for the government to say this is what we should be doing. They see a need, they see their young people, they see that they need to develop that voice within young people, and they do that work. So, and that continues. That level of resistance continues from educators. But I'm hopeful. But it was a no.
In short. Would anyone else like to respond to that?
Well, I mean, in terms of museums, I mean, Pavilion Museums, our main stakeholder is Brighton Hove City Council, and they are fabulous. They're incredibly supportive. So thanks to them, it's one of the reasons I felt very comfortable coming to work in Brighton, knowing what a progressive council there was here. So that's great. Our other main stakeholder is Arts Council England, who are an arm's length body and have worked very hard to be an independent arm's length body. However, you don't need me to tell you that in terms of the government at the moment and culture and museums, it's very complicated. It's very complicated, and we've got Prime Minister and a Secretary of State who are struggling with some of the things that are going on, and that is making it difficult, particularly for those museums that are more closely linked to central government. You know, there is an ongoing and live debate there. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah. Q has just announced that it's decolonizing. You might have just heard this. So this has brought in a huge wave of anxiety, and there's been lots of challenges. Q has to answer why it's about its woke culture. I think the director gave an article in the Guardian, recently wrote in the Guardian about this. So I think it's happening. And I'm glad it's happening, but it's very little, very late.
Mm.
Brighton, in Black history, we've never really had significant government, small amounts of money. And the council is supported, but is strapped for cash, as all local councils are. So probably negligible in the same way that Orlene said.
Mm. This may not be exactly the same, but I heard that the National Trust recently got rid of their director, and I was thinking, oh no, because of being too sort of, I don't know, just not being modern enough. It turns out that the members voted him out because he was trying to decolonise the properties, and that's, yeah. So there's a different sort of the sort of popular opinion in that organisation was to, we don't want that. We don't want the history of slavery to be in these houses and gardens to be something that we have to think about, which is interesting. Not quite the question. Are there any other questions that are coming in?
Yeah. Okay. So, how do the panel believe it's best to balance honesty, addressing the harms of the past without becoming trapped in reinforcing narratives of oppression across the different contexts and practices? So I guess it's a sense of which we kind of, at the level of discourse, we end up reproducing certain narratives in the effort to kind of contest them or be honest about what's happened in the past.
I think that's a really good question because it feeds into one of the issues we've had within Black history about this constant sort of dialectic between the oppressor and the victim, and how that, when we've been doing, we recently did a project about a slave boy who's buried in Brighton and his story arriving here, and how that created a space for local school children to talk about the transatlantic slave trade. And one of the things that came back from the school's work was how refreshing it was to have a story which wasn't just about that which perpetrated a narrative that we've all become so inured to. And I think that it is important to find different ways of telling that story, because as Vinita said, you can do that. You could do an exhibition called Loot and make it a way in which you looked at all the different ways in which different objects.
You should.
And just create new ways. You can use you can use different ways of telling a story which doesn't rehash a power narrative. So I think it takes imagination, creativity, but it can be done, I would say.
Sure.
Yeah. I think it does take imagination, and I think that's probably something we're most strapped for because of time. It's very difficult without the support of, or having the culture that supports that. That can be very challenging. When we spoke to parents, there was a survey that was done, and parents were very articulate about not wanting those narratives of oppression anymore. So actually feeling quite stressed when their children were learning about slavery. Or I just had an interaction with my 13-year-old daughter who's doing Of Mice and Men, and how challenged she felt by the use of derogatory terms in there. And I think it's really important to have the discussion and the dialogue, but to be absolutely clear about the context. And the discussion that I had with, try not to be too personal, my child's school, was that actually it's really important that you teach this, and yes, you teach the context, but if my daughter's still offended, it means we haven't taught the context well enough. So actually having discussions, having open discussions, but also where are the words? So I understand that children have to learn about enslavement, but that's not a balanced view, and that's what the parents are saying to us. It's not balanced to have just enslavement as part of your curriculum. Actually, we don't want our children to learn about enslavement. We want them to learn about the positive aspects of their community. We want them to know about the cultural strengths that have made them who they are, and it's really important that our children are not believing that enslavement is the sum of their history, because actually it's not their history. Their history has many powerful people and kingdoms, and unless we're teaching that, then we're failing them terribly.
Yeah, expanding the field is of what?
I mean, I'd go beyond expanding the field. I think there is no field at the moment if you look at some of our curriculum. So I think actually it's about it's about thinking about actually, for all of our young people, it's really important that they recognise the strengths of the communities that they engage with, that have made the UK what it is today, that the UK would not be what it is without all of these contributions, and that there were very positive contributions. And until our young people have those discussions, I think we will keep coming back to those narratives of oppression.
Yeah, no, I mean, the quiet sort of passion that you show here, I would say that the reaction to woke cultures, is, you need it. You need to see, I don't know, images that you don't make you feel uncomfortable. In some senses, it's like the cruel radiance, what makes you uncomfortable, and because it's been invisible so far, is what you need to see, and you need to internalize it, and you need to understand it as part of the educational process. And I feel, whether you are then in this loop, I would say, go as far as to say, you need to put reparations back on the table. Reparations needs to be on the table. I mean, I don't think people want to talk about it yet. But I think it should be discussed in institutions and in museums and everywhere else.
We can come back to that perhaps towards the end, but Hedley, I'm sure this is a question
Well, I mean, yes, and I mean, museums would currently talk about, context. I mean, as you said, context, multiple voices, multiple views, incredibly important. But yeah, there are no easy answers because there ain't no easy history.
I think I see museums as spaces where it is possible, to have that kind of imagination and creativity, perhaps to be able to start to have this kind of nuance and these multi-dimensional sort of senses of history and its consequences, and that's what museums can do.
They can do. And what's very encouraging is that museums are still seen as very trusted spaces, which is very reassuring. And people in museums are trusted. So places where you can go and have open debates in a secure, trusted way, I think is really important. I think there is a huge responsibility on us. And in this sense, probably a little bit old-fashioned. I think it's incredibly important that we are authoritative in a positive way. In that, when we say things, it's to the best of our knowledge, it is the truth, whatever the truth is, or or the best of our knowledge, we're drawing on the best evidence we possibly can. I think that's really important. But then that thing of listening very carefully, and being places where debates can take place, and then reflecting those debates back. And then, I mean, almost all of you have made that point about the importance of coming into a museum and seeing everyone in there, not just single narratives, so seeing different sorts of people, different. We've just got a young one of our young trustees who's just joined us. And she's in her mid-20s, and she said she'd never thought of museums as being for her until she came in and saw our exhibition on transology and some of the work we'd done on gay rights. And she said, and suddenly thought about museums completely differently. So, I mean, obviously we should be taking that and say everybody who come, firstly, everybody should feel comfortable coming to our museums, and everybody when they're in there should see things that they feel reflect them and their experience. And I guess that's.
Yeah, I was just going to add that Anthony Gormley, it does fit. Anthony Gormley suggested that the road statue in Oxford, the article of what should we do, they refused to take it down. Something you mentioned it earlier on, but his idea was that it should be turned to face the wall, like it was near the end of the Blair Witch Project or something like that, which was probably the best idea he's ever had. And it's a nice creative solution.
The road statue is so stark that there you had a vast number of people who all said it is the right thing to do to take the statue down, and a group of academics who all said we must take this down, and then came out and said, I'm sorry, we can't take it down. And you thought, what is going on here? That was so stark. And they said, it would take too long.
Yeah.
No.
We haven't got the equipment.
If it needs to happen, it needs to happen. And if it takes too long, start now. But unbelievable. But let's not go there.
Yeah, well, I went some way of the way there, but I think we have another question.
We're going to have to wrap it up after these. We've got a comment that definitely could spark discussion and a question, so I'll read them both out as kind of open-ended things, and then we'll have to move towards a conclusion. So first of all, what's the panel's thoughts on museums returning gifted, in scare quotes, artefacts back to the countries that they have originated from? And then also, it's also about looking at what's happening in other places in the world. In the Caribbean, slavery is taught in a way where it emphasises the agency of the slave community, the strategic approach to resistance, and the impact on the decision to end slavery.
Anyone was just going.
I mean, the return, the repatriation. Again, from a position of Brighton, we have the relative luxury that although we have some objects that most certainly were taken under incorrect circumstances, we would be very open to discussions return. And when people asked us about we have 2 or 3 objects from Benin, we've been very open and said if the request came, we would absolutely want to return them. And my experience of dealing with human remains 15 years ago I was horrified that scientists were saying, no, we must keep these things because they have huge scientific value, but couldn't actually articulate what that value was or how they'd been used for scientific value. And these were people were asking for their return for whom they were of fundamental importance to their culture. I was horrified. So I am a believer in repatriation. However, also as a museum professional, you know, I have some sympathy for the directors of the major national museums because I know what they are thinking. They cannot see where this will end up, you know. So I would guess, I haven't spoken to the director of the British Museum, I would guess in his heart of hearts he would quite like to consider the return of the Benning bronzes, but he knows that once that would return, then would be the Elgin marbles, and then within a couple of years it would be empty building. So you know,
It'd be actually great. Postcards where stuff was, and you know. Sorry, go on. Would anyone else like to? Sarah, then Orlene, then Vinita.
I love the idea of that, of the depopulation of the museum, and I think that, in a sense,
Echoey.
There's something exquisite and also really poignant about that. I think the notion again is back to this words of back to my favourite word, overused word, iterative. I would love to see, not necessarily it's about repatriation as in it's truth and reconciliation, what we need to do is do this and then it's all sorted. I think it's actually about that sort of partnership. So I would love to see museums being brave enough to start to have projects around how this could be, I suppose, how this could be broached in a way, and I applaud what Vinita's been doing around repatriation of specimens within the work that you've done that I know, which it has created that sense of a dialogue. So perhaps it's not necessarily about repatriation itself being the solution, but the dialogue around which one could ensue around that process, because that actually to me is far more powerful than just one, again, a gesture. I'm reluctant just to hang things around one gesture, but that would be great to see.
I mean, I got stuck at the word gifted, to be honest with you. I didn't hear the rest of the question. Because that struck me as, and obviously in inverted commas, but I do think, what I would say is that I do think there is a very clear relationship between resistance to decolonisation and the road to repatriation. And I think that's something that we have to take into consideration, that resistance may somehow be about how we stop that journey or slow that journey down, and I think that's quite an interesting dynamic to consider.
No, I think it's part of the story of recognition. I mean, if you look at the recent literature that's coming out by economic historians, Britain took 45 trillion out of India, 45 trillion. So if you're talking about returning things, you know, the scale of it is unbelievable, right? So, okay, but I would still say, yeah, that needs to be done along the ways in which both of you have suggested. The dialogue needs to happen. You might say returning things to war-torn countries might be dangerous, as Gandhi would say, leave India to anarchy or God, you know. So there is a sense in which these things morally have to be returned. I mean, that's what I feel. Whether you do it through a process like Sarah is saying is important as well, probably. And as to the second question on how do you retell the story of slavery as through the agency of slaves, yes, you could tell it that way, but you need to also tell it the way in which it is. I mean, it is a blot on our society, and that story should not, you know, just like colonialism was a blot, that the fact that some Indians made money while others didn't and died of famines, 10 million in the 1717 famine of Bengal, doesn't retract from the fact that, you know, there were certain people who did make money and bankrolled the East India Company, the Bunnias, for example. So yeah, you need to tell all those stories, but it doesn't reduce the fact that there is a huge moral wrong that happened and continues to happen in the way in which structural racism works today, the way in which the G7 countries have sat together to discuss whether they need to give 1 billion vaccines to the global south, and they've just, you know, wow, thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. Reparation is a long way from the agenda at the moment, as we see the aid budget being reduced and that being...
Yeah, absolutely. Everywhere we turn,
times.
there are these things. We need a Gandhian movement.
Well, Orlene, you mentioned a roadmap, the idea of roadmaps, and that you needed to see roadmaps. I know we only have a few minutes left, 3 minutes, I would say. My watch is, it is, right? So we just very quickly, it's just kind of, I mean, I suppose when we have the kind of notion of the iterative and, how it's difficult to see where all of this is going, but it would, I mean, just, would anyone volunteer some sense of their kind of personal roadmap in some way, just sort of going around from Hedley through to, is there a place that, or a way station, a place that you think it'd be good to get to push this agenda somewhere?
So as I've said, for us, I would like to get to a stage quite quickly, but it would still probably be a couple of years, where I could truly look at every corner of Pavilion museums and know that every corner was, dealing with equality and diversity in the way that it should do. Not just, the World Art Bid or every corner of the museum. And I think that is doable.
Okay. So.
I suppose, going back to my original point about being both a gamekeeper and a poacher, I'd like to get to a point in the work that I do where I don't need to wear one hat to go and speak to an academic, that I then need to put another hat to go and speak to someone from the local Nigerian society, or when I'm doing my educational work. So I would like there to be a level playing field where people all speak a language where at least, even if they know that there are nuances and differences in language, they know that, they recognise it, and they don't wait for one person to come to them, they will go to each other. So it's about that levelling of power and mutual recognition and respect.
Right, yeah, great.
Yeah. I would agree with that, definitely, about that levelling of power and honest levelling of power. But I think there's some similarities between what I would hope for education and museums, because I think we do have to have a wider discussion about repatriation, and I think the roadmap towards that is that we have an honest retelling of the story until we get to a closer space. So how are we making sure that we're retelling the story of enslavers, statues? How are we ensuring that we're retelling the story of artefacts that are in museums? How are we honestly retelling the story of the curriculum that children are facing in the UK? And that will help, I think that will support us on that journey, but knowing that the end goal is reparation.
Reparations is the end of the big, okay.
Yeah,
Vinita.
taking on from that, this is, I am still quite pessimistic with where I talked about the shut door. Borders are being tightened as we speak. The world that we imagined, the emancipatory political and economic future that we wanted is still quite far away. So our colonial legacy, and how do we retell that story towards an emancipatory future, I think is still quite a long way off. And I don't see it getting any better.
Okay. Well, there's still a long way to go. I think we have to recognise that. But it's really good actually to get some sense of possible goals and sort of things that we might do that would be feel like some kind of measure of success, I think. But let's just get together and thank our speakers for such an interesting discussion and wrap it up there.
A huge thanks to our audience, to our panellists, for everyone for attending, to Sussex Festival of Ideas, and to our partners for today's event, the Royal Pavilion and Museums Trust, Brighton. Thanks, everyone. Absolutely awesome.